Okay, so today we are going to take a look at the effect that either shifts the aggregate demand or aggregate supply curve and how that affects real GDP, price level, and unemployment. Okay, so let's take a look. Congress passes a tax cut for the middle class. So first we have to ask, is this going to shift aggregate demand or aggregate supply? And the answer is aggregate demand, because a tax cut would affect the amount of money a consumer has to spend and therefore increase consumer spending. Consumer spending affects demand because it is a part of the demand equation CIGXN, where C stands for consumer spending, I stands for investment, G stands for government spending, and XN stands for net imports. Okay, so now that we know there's an increase in consumer spending, which also means there is an increase in aggregate demand, shifting aggregate demand to the right. Okay, so now we are going to draw our graph of aggregate demand and aggregate supply. So in model equilibrium, so we have to make sure that price level is labeled on the y-axis and real GDP is labeled on the x-axis. And then we start with the short run aggregate supply, which is an upward slope. So aggregate supply, and aggregate demand, which is a downward slope. And then find the equilibrium right over here at PE and our GDP E. There is our equilibrium. And the two curves meet at price level and real GDP equilibrium. So there we go. Okay, so now we are going to apply the shift. So when you are shifting aggregate demand to the right, you simply move the curve to the right. So you just make a new curve, label it aggregate demand 2, draw a little arrow, and then find your new equilibrium over here at GDP 2, maybe leave yourself a little bit more room, oh well, and at P2 for price level 2. So there we go, there's our shift in aggregate demand. So now we're going to determine what this shift affects in the economy, and specifically how it affects real GDP, price level, and unemployment. So if we observe the graph, we see that the equilibrium on the x-axis, or where GDP is, has shifted to the right, meaning it has increased on the x-axis. So looking at the graph, GDP has increased. So we're going to draw a little up arrow here for increased. So then if we go over here for the y-axis, we can see that price level equilibrium has also increased with the demand shift. So we can also say that price level has increased with a little arrow over here. So now, for unemployment. Unemployment has decreased, and there's no way to tell unemployment from looking at the graph, but we know that unemployment is always opposite of GDP. This is because GDP is a measure of output, and when output is rising, that means more is being produced and more resources are being employed, including labor resources, which increases employment. And when employment increases, unemployment decreases. So therefore, unemployment is always opposite of GDP, which is an easy way to help you determine the effects of a shift by just looking at the graph. Okay, so in review. First, ask yourself what is going to be affected, whether it's aggregate supply or aggregate demand, and then determine what direction this curve is shifting, and then observe from the graph how real GDP, price level, and unemployment are affected. Good luck in your studies. Hope this helped. Thanks for the extra credit, Mr. McGrain.